What I'd like to do now in this session is have a look at one of the three poisons. So remember the three poisons, the three main mental afflictions was ignorance, attachment, aversion. Ignorance, again, the distorted view of reality. And as we're going to see tomorrow morning, or maybe even later this afternoon if we have time, how a distorted view of reality leads to attachment and aversion, and how they then lead to the other mental afflictions and how we end up being stuck in this state of dukkha. And so what I'd like to do now is look at one of the three poisons, that of aversion, in particular anger. Anger is a particular form of aversion. It's a very strong type of aversion. So remember, anger is defined as a mental factor that sees its object as unattractive. It exaggerates the object's unattractiveness and then wishes to harm the object. Why? Because anger sees that object as a source of our suffering. So these three poisons, of course, are the three main mental afflictions, and so we are to eliminate them 100%. And generally, we understand that anger is quite destructive, but sometimes, and we want to eliminate it, but sometimes there's some doubts about this. And sometimes people say, yes, okay, it's destructive, but there are certain times I need anger to deal with difficult situations. If I don't have anger, I can't deal with difficult situations. Yes, it is true that anger is very forceful. No doubt about that. No one's arguing that it's not forceful. But as we saw in the definition of anger, it exaggerates and distorts. And we know from our own experience, particularly if we have very strong anger, we tend to very much exaggerate and distort. And then we often end up overreacting. And rather than dealing with difficult situations effectively, it gets worse. So Buddhism says that we don't need anger to deal with difficult situations. And instead, often you'll find in Buddhism it says, instead of getting angry, practice patience. But then when that's said, then often there's more misunderstanding. Because people think, oh, okay, what I need to do then is sit there and do nothing. This is not patience. Patience is not a behavior, at least not how it's defined in Buddhism. Patience is a mental attitude. Patience is defined as an undisturbed mind in the face of a difficult situation. So when Buddhism says practice patience, Buddhism says when you're faced with a difficult situation, remain calm. Why? So we can better evaluate what's really going on. Because if we get agitated and get angry, we exaggerate and distort and then usually overreact. So if we practice patience, means just remain calm so we can better see what the real situation is. So we can have a better chance of more correctly evaluating what's really going on. And then what would be the forceful thing we need to deal with those difficult situations? And the Buddhist answer is compassion. And often here there's a lot of confusion. Because often people hear, oh, be compassionate. People think, oh, I have to sit there and smile and say nice things to people. This is not compassion. Compassion is not a behavior. Compassion is a mental attitude. Compassion is the wish or aspiration for ourselves and others to be free of suffering and its causes. So if someone is behaving badly, and we're trying to practice compassion for them, then we're trying to help them to stop that bad behavior. Which means if that person is physically attacking ourselves or someone else, then compassion would result in us using physical force if necessary to restrain that person. Of course, if we get angry, we often overreact, use excessive force, big mess. So we can use compassion as the strong force to help that person. And we may need, if we need to use physical force, we will use that. Because often people feel that anger is a sign of strength and compassion is a sign of weakness. But actually it's the exact opposite. Anger is a sign of weakness. It means we can't effectively deal with situations without trying to dominate someone. That's a sign of weakness, that we can't deal with it without dominating them. And compassion is a sign of strength. There was a question over here before I move on.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about why is it that we're treating aversion and anger, well, like you talked about aversion, but then you gave a definition for anger, and they are slightly different, aren't they?
Okay. So aversion is this wanting to separate, wanting to push away. And this can take many levels, from sort of mild irritation to annoyance, to anger, to rage, I mean, many levels. And so, in a practical sense, the one level of aversion that is very destructive is anger. So you'll find that in Buddhism, that gets the spotlight a lot. But what we are to understand in the three poisons, that the dynamic there that's underlying that is this wanting to push away. Because the other dynamic is wanting to get the pleasant and wanting to push away the unpleasant.
But isn't it slightly different? I mean, in aversion we want to get away and avoid it, and in anger the definition was that we want to harm it. So we do want...
But we want to harm it because we want it to stop.
Okay.
We want it to stop. No?
I mean, in a way too, but personally I feel that if I'm angry and I want to hurt something, then if I'm just away from it, that's not enough. I want to harm it, not just...
Because pushing away will only get us away from us temporarily, but if we kill it or damage it, then maybe for good that it's not going to bother us anymore. No?
Yeah.
And here, again, part of the difficulty with this is the word anger. So what we saw here in Buddhism, the way the word anger is used, is there's always this intention to harm. Whereas that word anger, I think used in other contexts, is a little bit different. And this became very obvious to me recently. I was reading a book in psychology, and I think it was quite well, I can't remember who it was, but it was a quite well-known psychologist. And he was talking about anger, he said, those Buddhists have got it completely wrong. Actually, they've got it completely wrong. It's not about getting rid of anger, it's about having the right type of anger at the right time in the right amount. Because he said, if you don't have that, how would you deal with difficult things like social injustice? And it became very apparent to me how he was using the word anger was very different than how it's actually defined in Buddhism. So I think he wasn't really aware of how the word anger is defined in Buddhism. Because what he was using as anger, this dealing with social injustice, was using a very forceful mind. And it's a little bit like the example that sometimes I give is that, let's say a young child runs across the road without looking and nearly gets run over, and the mother sees that. Often the mother won't go, "Oh, please, Johnny, don't do that. That's dangerous." No? Usually she'll often use very strong language to get through to the child that it's dangerous. And then someone else sees that, they go, "Oh, she's really angry." But yes, if she wanted to hurt the child, according to Buddhism, that would be anger. But generally she's not wanting to hurt the child, she's wanting to help the child, but she's using very strong language and behavior to get through to the child that it's dangerous. But I think this sort of forceful behavior in psychology we call anger sometimes. So we need to be clear about that when we use the word anger in Buddhism, inbuilt in that is the intention to harm. It's not, and if we're using very forceful behavior motivated by compassion, often in Buddhism this would be called something like a forceful or wrathful compassion. So again, it's not so much the outward behavior, it's what's underlying that that's important, the motivation.
It makes sense that compassion is much more effective than anger. But still, why is the default anger?
Why is the default? We're going to talk about that now. At the deepest level, of course, the default is anger because of ignorance. Because we have a distorted view of reality. And we're going to look at why that is tomorrow morning, or maybe even a little bit this afternoon if we get time. So we'll look at that, but at a more immediate level, the answer will come hopefully now. So the question is, why is it that we get angry at people who behave badly, particularly if they're directed at us? And why is it so difficult to have forgiveness or compassion for them? Even to the point where we say they don't deserve it. Why is that? And the answer is very simple. Let's say someone's behaving badly. The correct perspective would be to simply acknowledge and see there is a person who's doing a bad or harmful behavior. So that's the correct perspective. But often in such a situation, we don't adopt the correct perspective. Rather, our perspective often is, there's a bad person, there's a horrible person, a nasty person. So what we've done here is we have fused the person and the behavior together and made them one thing. In psychology, this is called cognitive fusion. Cognitive fusion. And this is how we often think and speak. And this leads to difficulties, problems. Because in any given situation, we've got two choices: accept, reject. And generally, if someone's behaving badly, we reject. But if we reject and we do cognitive fusion, what we do is we end up attacking the person. Because the thing we don't like is their behavior. But if we stick the behavior to the person, then we end up directing at the person. We attack the person. And of course, attacking the person is not helpful because generally they react and it's a big mess. But then, of course, if we understand that this is not helpful, then the only other option left is accept. And then if we've done cognitive fusion, accept translates into accepting their bad behavior. Which of course also is not helpful. And then of course, when it comes to forgiveness or compassion, it becomes almost impossible. Because forgiveness or compassion for a bad person feels like we are condoning their bad behavior, we're accepting their bad behavior. And of course we don't want to do that. But because we've stuck the person to the behavior, then it becomes almost impossible to have forgiveness and compassion, even to the point where we say they don't deserve it. And it's even worse than that. Because if we do this, then what we end up with is a fixed, biased view of that person. Because everyone sometimes does good things and everyone sometimes does not so good things. But if we identify a person with one of their bad behavior and then we see him as a bad person, then we end up with this fixed, biased view, and it becomes almost impossible to acknowledge any good behavior, because bad people don't do good things. So if they do a good behavior, we'll brush it off and say, oh, they didn't really mean it because they're a bad person. So we end up with a fixed, biased view of the person. So, and this is why people have this dilemma about forgiveness and compassion, because if we do cognitive fusion, it really feels like forgiveness and compassion is somehow we are accepting their bad behavior. And of course we're not. So the solution is not moving between these, because we end up either getting angry or we end up accepting their bad behavior. I mean, both of those are not helpful. The solution, of course, is don't do cognitive fusion, because it's a false, invalid perspective. There are two things here. There is a person and their behavior. So if we simply adopt the correct perspective and acknowledge there is a person doing a bad or harmful action, then we can accept the person, i.e. have compassion for the person, and at the same time reject their negative behavior, not tolerate their negative behavior, and address their negative behavior. And also here, one problem with the cognitive fusion, of course, is cognitive fusion causes division. Because they're the bad guy, but I'm the good guy. I'm the good guy, they're the bad guy. We need to get rid of bad guys. Of course, somehow we sort of miss out that, oh, actually, sometimes I do bad things too. But, oh, I'm the good guy. I'm the good guy. They're the bad guy. So if we do cognitive fusion, you end up with division. Whereas if we adopt the correct perspective, we can acknowledge we're all humans, all wanting to be happy. We all sometimes do good things, sometimes do bad things. And then if people do bad things, including ourselves, we have compassion for ourselves and others, and we address that negative behavior. Because the result that we want is we want ourselves and others to stop doing bad things. But this approach is not going to get that. Whereas if we use the correct perspective, we can have compassion for ourselves and others, and we can address that negative behavior, whether it's ourselves or others. So this correct perspective brings people together and has a better chance of coming up with a resolution. Question?
Yeah, one problem is that even if you have the correct perspective and you don't perform cognitive fusion, the person themselves, they have cognitive fusion. So when you address their bad behavior, they feel that you're attacking them as a person. They do the fusion themselves.
Correct, they will, but if we use language that supports this, we have some possibility of them seeing that.
It's not easy.
It's not easy. No one said it was easy.
It's a long-term solution.
Sure. But, I mean, if we really adopt this perspective and we really have compassion for the person and we use language, I mean, of course, if we say you're a horrible person, I mean, then of course they're going to react. But if we have really compassion and we say, do you realize this behavior is really causing a lot of suffering? Then if they're then we've got some chance they can sense maybe we're caring for them and that we're addressing their bad. And it's not so direct at them. Of course, if they're doing heavy cognitive fusion and they're sort of really in a lot of mental afflictions, they're not going to be able to listen. So that's why with compassion, you need to always have wisdom. And here, wisdom would be, okay, I think this person is completely out of control at the moment. They're in rage. So whatever I say, it's just like throwing petrol on the fire. So wisdom says, okay, let me just back out a bit, let them blow off a bit of steam, let them calm down. Then I'll try and use this sort of wording to say, do you realize this behavior is very harmful, so. Of course, there's no guarantee that they're going to listen or understand, but if we really use this approach, I think we have some chance of getting through to them in a good way. And on this point, you know, we have this approach in our society. You know, like if someone does a crime, what do? We judge them. So judging people is cognitive fusion. And actually, on a side point of that, before I go on, is often in a lot of modern day mindfulness movements, you often hear something like, mindfulness means to be, being aware in the present moment in a non-judgmental way. But then, people who do cognitive fusion and they hear non-judgmental, they end up doing this. And I hear people say this, non-judgmental, I have to accept everything. Everything's okay. I mean, that's an ethical disaster. Non-judgmental really means don't do this. Non-judgmental means do this. We have to evaluate behaviour for ourselves and others. We have to, otherwise it's a mess. But again, coming back to the point I was talking about, is we do this in our judicial system. You know, we judge people, and usually in the penal system, we punish people. And statistics show if we punish people in jail, they reoffend. They're a higher cost to society if we use that approach. So therefore, even from a purely economical reasons, stop punishing people because it costs more for society. Rather, we adopt this and we punish crimes and we try and rehabilitate the person. And countries that try to do that find less cost to society and people less reoffending. In fact, based on this approach, I saw a program not so long ago, I think it was in Norway, where they're really using this system, and they have this, they were interviewing, it was in a maximum security prison, like for the worst offenders, usually in maximum security lockdown. In this maximum security prison, there were no bars on the windows, no one had tried ever to escape. And because the prisoners saw that people were caring for them, trying to help them, so they didn't try to escape. So, of course, there's no guarantee, but if we use this approach, better end result.
In one word, education.
Sorry?
In one word, it's a long-term education.
But see, the problem is here that, I don't know about in Hebrew, but in English, this way of speaking is pervasive.
Look at Israel.
Yeah, but, okay. But I mean, this way of speaking is pervasive, you know, like even from a very young age, you know, a little child misbehaves, how does the parent often reply? Bad girl, bad boy. I mean, this is a disaster. And of course, then, that's why we have low self-esteem. That's why this is the cause for low self-esteem. It's because people keep telling us we're bad, we identify with that, and we go, oh, I'm a bad person, I'm a hopeless person, I'm no good, and we end up with low self-esteem. But then, unfortunately, then often some modern therapies, understanding this is a big problem, they flip to the other extreme. And they say, no, you're special. You're a special person. I mean, disaster. Because one of two things will happen. If you believe it, you'll get a big head thinking you're better than everyone else, which is mess. Or secondly, you'll realize that you're not special because you'll see that you're not special. Then that'll even confirm more that you're hopeless. So you'll go even further to the other extreme.
Depression.
Yeah, exactly. So the answer to low self-esteem is not trying to convince people that they're special people. The answer is stop doing cognitive fusion, and then we can have good self-esteem. And this is really the difference also. I'll go on now to, we do this with others, but we do this with ourselves even more. Even more. If we have done a negative behaviour, what do? Bad me, bad me. So we attack ourselves, low self-esteem, self-hatred. Epidemic in our modern society. And this is also where guilt comes from. If we've done something bad and we feel guilty, what are we focusing on?
Me.
Bad me, bad me. And unfortunately, I think over the centuries, guilt has been used as a way of having power over people. Because if you can put the guilt trip on people, you can control them.
This is the Polish.
Yeah.
Not only Polish,
It's also Tunisian. It's okay.
Actually, when I teach this in Tushita, and there's a lot of Israelis there and other people, when I talk about the guilt thing, then what I've heard over the years is there seems to be two groups of people that suffer most from guilt: the Irish Catholics and the Polish Jews. So therefore, we don't need to feel guilty about anything, because guilt is based on a false perspective. It's a false perspective. I mean, guilt is completely useless because all it does is it paralyzes us, makes us feel bad. It doesn't even address our bad behavior. So it's completely useless. Throw it out.
That's why we started compassion with ourselves.
Exactly. So therefore, if we simply adopt the correct perspective and acknowledge, I have done this bad behavior, then instead of guilt, we have regret. Because if we regret, we're regretting the bad behavior. So regret comes from a correct perspective, whereas guilt comes from cognitive fusion, completely invalid. So therefore, if we develop regret, we can have compassion for ourselves, so we can still feel good about ourselves, but at the same time not tolerate our negative behavior, address our negative behavior and try to work to overcome it. Okay, there was a number of questions. First was here.
So that's pretty specifically what you said earlier, but what do you mean by punishing bad action and not, like, punishing the action and not the person?
It means that we have compassion and wisdom and trying to help that person to overcome that bad behavior. So in our society, of course, if that bad behavior is like killing people and so forth, as part of that, we may need to pull them out of society to try and rehabilitate them, but not punish them. Try and rehabilitate. Maybe we can't rehabilitate, but at least we keep them out of danger for themselves and society. So we use wisdom and compassion, but basically it involves education. And we try to do that. Of course, no guarantee it'll work, but that's the best chance we've got.
Talking about cognitive fusion, may I assume that cognitive fusion is also not a good idea even when you do good things?
Very good. I was waiting for someone to say that. Perfect. In fact, that's exactly the point. Exactly. What do we do now? If someone does something good, what happens? We praise them. Disaster. Absolute disaster. I mean, all it'll do really is give them a big head thinking they're special, they're better than it. It's just an ego trip. And it doesn't even encourage them to continue that behavior because they're just being praised themselves. So therefore, praising people is a disaster. But what we must do is praise their behavior. So if someone is doing a good thing, then we praise the behavior. And then they won't get a big head, they'll feel good about themselves, and that'll inspire them to continue to do the good behavior. Similarly with ourselves, if we do a good thing, don't praise yourself. It's a disaster. It'll just get a big head.
Who did this behavior? Not me.
Yeah, you did, but you're not the behavior. So here, this is a very good point, is...
Who is me?
Oh,
Who is me?
that's another question, but we don't need to worry about that here. So what we're saying is there are two things here. There's a person and the behavior, not one thing. But no one said it so far, but this cognitive fusion means we're identifying, we're making them one thing. But then often people say, well, we need to separate them. But that's the other extreme. So the two extremes here is identification and separation. I didn't do that. It wasn't me. So what we need to do, this is not separation, this is distinguishing. Because you can't have a behavior without a person. And there's a person who does the behavior. But there are two elements here. And if we identify them, we end up with this problem. If we cut, then we go, I didn't do anything. It wasn't me.
If I say to my wife, I love the way you behaved, she will be like the same day, no?
Sure what?
We live at home. No.
I'm not so sure you're right.
No.
Not so right.
We asked her, she's
Right.
You are expecting to be praised. You, not
No, expecting, no. No, because if we do this, see, if we do this, that's another thing in our modern society. If we do cognitive fusion, we identify ourselves with our behavior, which means if we don't get praised, we're nothing. Whereas if we don't identify with the behavior, we can feel good about ourselves. Here, we can only feel good about ourselves if we get praised.
What is the origin of you feeling good or bad, if not what you did, what the reaction towards you?
This is the whole problem. This is why we suffer so much, is because of this. What we're talking about when we're talking about genuine happiness is we can feel good about ourselves regardless of what's going on.
What is the origin of me feeling good about myself?
The original.
What is the origin of me feeling good or bad about myself, if not the reaction that I get from outside the world?
This is the whole problem. This is the... Yeah. Okay, wait. Yeah. I mean, the reason we can't feel good about ourselves is exactly this, is this fundamental ignorance. And that feeds into this cognitive fusion. That's why we don't feel good about ourselves. This is coming. It's coming. We're jumping ahead. We're jumping ahead. We'll look at that a little bit tomorrow morning. And of course, this is going to be taught in Module 12 in detail, the wisdom. So you'll have to attend Discovering Buddhism Module 12 for the big answer. I'll give the short answer tomorrow morning.
It is dangerous.
What's dangerous? What's dangerous?
I'll tell you, because we look at ourselves also through our actions.
Correct.
So we don't say that we are bad or good in a fusion with our actions, but if we want to be ethical, we look at our actions.
Correct. So therefore, we need to evaluate our actions without judging ourselves. Because this is judging ourselves.
And
This is evaluating our behavior. So this leads to ethics. This leads to low self-esteem, self-hatred, and nothing apart from that. Yeah, this is judging. This is evaluating. We need to evaluate. Discriminate, evaluate, yes.
See the two dynamics is, one is a downward spiral, doesn't matter if you do good or bad, and the other one is an upward spiral. Because even if you do something which is good, if you do cognitive fusion, you cannot analyze what you did right.
No, you're not looking at your behavior, you're just puffing up yourself thinking you're special.
Wow.
I'm fantastic.
Wow, what?
Yeah.
How are you going to next time.
You
What
guys-
did you do right?
Yeah.
Could you have done it in a better way still? No. You cannot do it if you do
No.
cognitive fusion.
And worse than that is that, of course, in our modern society, we have so much emphasis on the negative. So like in our modern society, we could do probably 95% good things in a day, 5% negative, and at the end of the day, I was a horrible person today. I was a bad person today. And that's what we identify with.
This is Protestantic.
It's just, I mean, I understand how you can do that as an individual,
Sure.
but it's so rooted in our language,
Exactly.
in our social constructs.
And that's why we have so much suffering in the world. Exactly.
So how do you start to dismantle?
Because we start thinking and speaking in this way. That's all we can do. When you're interacting with people, don't say they're good or bad. Say, that was great, that behavior. And you can even get to the point where you leave out the agent. You know, you could say, you did a great thing is better than you're a great person. Better, you could say, wow, that was such a great behavior. Then it's like incidental, there's not really, oh, you happen to do it, but we're really focusing on that behavior is fantastic. You know, maybe they were generous, they offered some money to a charity or helped some people. You go, wow, helping these people was that's a fantastic thing to do. And you're not even mentioning them. But of course, then they know they did it, and that will boost their wanting to do that more. So this is how we should speak and think. And the more we do that, I think you'll find you'll have an effect on the people around us. Like one example was years ago when I talked about this, and in particular I talked about not identifying with like anger. And I remember there was a lady in the audience, this is in Dharamsala in Tishita, and she said, oh, that's interesting. She had 2 kids, 1, 3 and 4, and she said when they used to start to get angry, she didn't say, you're angry, which is cognitive fusion. She used to say to them, oh, look, there's that anger thing coming up in your mind again. And she said it was very helpful because it forced the child to see anger as an object rather than them. And she said it was very helpful in diffusing their anger. She said, look, there's that anger thing in your mind again. And then the child goes, oh. And then very often she said they could diffuse it. But if she just said you're angry, then disaster.
What happens, for example, if somebody, you just saw somebody kill a cat in the street and you talk to him about his behavior and
Sure.
you're trying to be compassionate and I said, oh, he really refuses to, So my question is, I really don't want to be angry about people.
Sure.
So how can you help yourself to be more compassionate? I think I have my own answers, but I really would like
Yeah.
to...
Again, I think the bottom line is don't see them as a bad person. See them as a person who did a very harmful thing, and then use your wisdom and compassion to try to help that person. Try to explain to them that's a very harmful thing or whatever. Is there a guarantee that we can change their way of thinking? No. But this is the best possibility we've got of doing that. Because if we do that, we're lost. They're like this. I mean, we're trying, it's not going to work. This is guarantee almost that they will harden their position. Whereas here, we've got some possibility of getting through to them.
Yeah, but my question is, if he totally doesn't agree and you really
Sure.
want to keep this behavior up in high,
Protect yourself.
keeping
Protect yourself.
so compassionate and accepting it. Because
But again, we're not accepting bad behavior. So if we do cognitive fusion, you'll lose compassion because they're a bad person. It's impossible to have compassion for a bad person.
Are there bad people?
And you'll find, no such thing as a bad person. There are people who do very bad things, yes, absolutely. There are people who do many very bad things.
I think a question
So, there was one more point I wanted to mention here. Now it slipped my mind. Oh, of course, then, so what you'll find, a measure of how much we're shifting our perspective instinctively is when we see someone behave badly, are we instinctively getting angry at them, or are we instinctively starting to have compassion for them? That's a measure of how much we have the correct perspective. That's a way of checking how we're going. And if we're really working on this, what you'll find is when you start to see people behave badly, you're instantly having compassion, and at the same time you're thinking, well, what can I do to, one, stop that bad behavior and help them to overcome it? Maybe there's nothing we can do, but at least we're not going to be doing this, which of course is never any use.
Is it effective to, like, when I see a leaf, I can discriminate between the color and the shape, that it's the same leaf. So this is a way of practicing. So like with a person and behavior, I can discriminate, but I don't separate.
No, separation is the other extreme.
Yeah.
So the two extremes is cognitive fusion, and the other extreme is doing this.
So it's the same. When I practice, I can see that I can discriminate the leaf from color and...
Yeah, because you can't have an action without an agent, and you can't have an agent without an action.
Yeah, but you can discriminate.
Exactly, that's what we have to distinguish. Yeah, exactly. That's what we need to do, of course.
I'm just wondering, for someone who's been teaching this, I guess, for a longer time, and this is ultimately the social media problem. I mean, everybody says back then, you know, you would be measured by what people tell you about your actions. Now most people measure themselves by how many likes they get. I mean, they will go volunteer, and they will measure if it was a good thing or not by the amount of likes they got on the picture.
Yeah.
And that's...
It's getting worse.
Is it getting worse?
Yes.
Well, if from your side you understand the like as they're liking something you did, that's good. If you think the like means you, then you're in trouble.
No, like, you say I did something good according to the likes you get. I ate at a good place according to how many people like the picture of your food. I mean, to me, the world is falling apart for that reason, for this cognitive fusion.
Of course.
I think it's gone out of control.
Of course, of course. And of course, things like social media can either be a wonderful tool to move in that direction, or they can make things much, much worse.
Do you think they ever move in that direction? The good direction?
I think one thing that I see is that through the social media, internet, and that this has been very much amplified. But because of that, I think for many people it's becoming much more obvious, and so then there's a shift back to the other direction. So I think it is heading in that direction, but the silver lining in the cloud is because then it becomes so obvious, there's an opposite reaction. Whether that opposite reaction can then steer it back that way, that's another question. Yeah. Okay. One more thing, and then we'll move on to attachment. Here we're talking about cognitive fusion in terms of person and behavior. But of course, we can talk about, as the example over here about the leaf and the shape and the color, we can also talk about person and mental afflictions, thoughts. You know, again, you know, if anger's coming up, we often go, I'm angry. I mean, this is cognitive fusion. I mean, disaster. So we can talk about, you know, either we are our thoughts or we have thoughts. We can't be our thoughts if we have thoughts, so we are not our thoughts. We have emotions, so we are not our emotions. We have certain behavior, so we're not our behavior. We have certain habits, so we're not our habits. We have a certain personality, so we are not our personality. And at the deepest level, we have a body and a mind, so we're not our body and mind. Yeah, that's the deepest level. So what we could say actually is cognitive fusion is the root of all suffering. Because it's ignorance. Okay. Question, yeah.
There was a very good example, I think, of this kind of implementation is in South Africa after the end of apartheid.
Yeah.
That Mandela brought in this process of reconciliation, where instead of punishing the former white military and police who committed the crimes.
Yeah.
They brought them together to meet with their victims, and they said, if you're prepared to do this, then you won't be sent to prison. And they weren't tried, but they had this reconciliation where they had to meet their victims, and it brought people together, and that was, you know, what people said, the greatness of the whole, the Mandela's transformation there, because you know, looking for a way to use, we would say, compassion and wisdom rather than vengeance and anger.
Exactly. Yeah, very good point. Okay, let's start to look at compassion, and then we'll take a break shortly. Look at attachment rather. So generally when we talk about anger and we need to eliminate it, we tend to appreciate that anger is very destructive. Okay, let's get rid of anger. But when we talk about attachment, getting rid of attachment, then there's often a lot more resistance to this. And often one of the things that people often say is that if I get rid of attachment, my life is going to become very bland and boring. I'm not going to be able to enjoy anything anymore. Actually, it's the exact opposite. Attachment interferes with our enjoyment of simple pleasures in life. Because we know from our own experience, particularly if we have very strong craving and attachment, generally with that comes worry and anxiety about not getting that thing. And with that comes frustration when we don't get that thing. And then often we overindulge and we end up with suffering. And then of course when it doesn't really fully satisfy us, we end up with a lot of dissatisfaction, disappointment, and then we simply end up craving more.
When you lose it, it's even...
Yeah, you end up craving more. And actually attachment's even worse than that. Because attachment is always looking for something bigger, better, and different.
What is attachment?
Life.
You know the dictionary explanation?
Yeah, better.
Attachment is, again, believing that the object that's giving us pleasure is a source of our happiness and trying to get it and hold it. And attachment, like I said, is even worse than all of these things we just mentioned that causes frustration, worry, anxiety, dissatisfaction, and so forth, is that it's always looking for something bigger, better, and different. And we know this from our own experience. If there's something we enjoy, but we get it too often, after not very long time, attachment goes, boring, boring, give me something different. So if we have our favorite food too often, attachment goes, not that again, give me something different. So we actually end up losing out on the things we used to enjoy because attachment says that's not good enough anymore.
It's very similar to jealousy.
Well, they're very closely related. And this was very much highlighted to me years ago when I did my first long meditation retreat. I was in Spain on the side of a mountain, and I was in a retreat cabin, and it was a place that they supplied food, a little basket of food every day they delivered to my cabin. And it was very nutritious food, but basically the same menu every week. So it doesn't take too many weeks in a row if we're eating the same food, we go, not that again, not that again. But my experience was the opposite. After about a month of eating this food, I thought it tasted better. And I'm thinking, wow, the cook's putting a lot more effort into the cooking now than a month ago, because this is tasting much better. They must be using more spices or, I don't know, something. And then after a couple more weeks, it kept tasting better. And then after about 6 or 7 weeks, I realized this is exactly the same food as 6 weeks ago. What's changed? And what changed was, of course, is being in retreat, the mind's calming down, the craving and attachment is settling down. And so I was actually starting to really enjoy and taste the food much more, because attachment's always there hoping for something better, 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 and it really agitates the mind and we don't really enjoy the food as much as we should. So if we can reduce and eliminate the attachment, you'll find you'll enjoy things much more than you've ever done in your life. And in fact, the same thing happened is I was in this retreat hut, side of a mountain, huge spacious view, Mediterranean in the distance. Very nice view. But again, if we're in a place that has a very nice view, it doesn't take too many days before we don't even notice it anymore. But my experience was it kept getting more and more beautiful. And even little tiny things like insignificant tiny little flowers, after a month or 6 weeks, I was like, wow, that's so amazing. And again, it's because my craving and attachment was settling down. I was appreciating the beauty that was always there around me. So if we reduce and eliminate attachment, I think what you're going to find is the simple pleasures in life you'll enjoy way more than you've ever done before in your life. And you'll start enjoying things that you now find very bland and boring, in fact. This is my experience, and of course, this is what Buddhism is saying here. But then people say, okay, let me think about that. That might be true. If I reduce my attachment, maybe I'll enjoy things more. Okay, let's see. But definitely I need attachment to have a relationship. If I don't have attachment, there'd be no basis for a relationship. Actually, it's the exact opposite again. Craving and attachment interferes with relationships, creates problems in a relationship. And here, part of the difficulty is terminology. Remember, the word attachment in Buddhism is this mental factor that sees its object as attractive, it exaggerates the object's attractiveness, and then wishes to possess and hold the object.
Can you say it again?
Yeah, it's a mental factor that sees its object as attractive, it exaggerates the object's attractiveness, and then wishes to possess and hold the object. Why? Because attachment believes that's the source of our happiness. Whereas the same word attachment in psychology is defined differently. Because in psychology we hear about attachment theory. In fact, they often talk about there are healthy forms of attachment we need to develop. If we don't, it's not psychologically healthy. And often one of the classic examples, of course, the strong bond between mother and child. And this is called attachment. Yeah. So, of course, there are unhealthy forms of attachment we need to get rid of. But a strong bond between mother and child is not necessarily attachment as attachment's known in Buddhism. In fact, we need to have strong bond between ourselves and everyone. And I think, again, it comes down to how the word attachment is defined. I've got a couple of definitions here that I picked up about attachment in psychology. One definition of attachment in psychology is an enduring emotional tie to a special person characterized by a tendency to seek and maintain closeness, especially during times of stress. Another definition is a feeling that binds one to a person, thing, cause, or the like. And another one is a feeling of affection for a person. And some synonyms for attachment is affection, devotion, regard, loyalty, love. A little bit different how it's defined in Buddhism. So what's the difference then between attachment and love or loving kindness? So in a relationship, attachment, of course, it's all about me. And attachment sees the other person as an object to satisfy me. Whereas loving kindness or love or loving kindness is simply the wish for that person to be happy. And of course the fine print is without expecting anything in return. What we would call unconditional love, no strings attached love. So love, conditional love or strings attached love, wish for them to be happy, yeah, without expecting anything in return. Conditional love or strings attached love is love polluted by attachment. And that sounds like this: I will love you as long as, and here comes the condition, as long as you keep saying and doing things that make me happy. Otherwise, no. So that's attachment speaking. So the very easy way to distinguish between love and attachment is love is saying, I want you to be happy. Attachment is saying, I want you to make me happy. So attachment's all about me, 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 and it sees the other person as an object to satisfy me. And on that point, Often in Buddhism, you'll hear people say things like, we are to love everyone equally. And then people get a very strange idea what that means. They think, oh, according to Buddhism, I have to spend the same amount of time with everyone and behave in the same way with everyone. Disaster. Disaster. Love, again, is not a behavior. Love is a mental attitude. Again, like compassion, love or loving kindness is the wish for ourselves and others to have happiness and its causes. So we can cultivate that wish equally for everyone. How we express that loving kindness will completely depend on our relationship with others. To our partner, we'd spend a lot of time with them and maybe intimate behavior. That same loving kindness we would express to our family members in a different way and spend less time with them. That same loving kindness we would express to our neighbour and work colleagues in a very different way, maybe spend no time with them. So when we say love everyone equally, we're simply talking about equally wishing everyone to be happy. One last point and then we'll take a break. And when that's explained, people go, okay, maybe that could be true. Maybe there is two dynamics going on. Maybe there's this loving kindness and attachment mixed together and I need to distinguish them and increase the loving kindness and decrease the attachment, then my relationships will improve. Okay, maybe that's true. But I'm a creative person and I need attachment to be creative. Again, completely opposite. Of course, mental afflictions such as craving, attachment, jealousy, anger provide a lot of fuel for creativity in terms of music and art and so forth. How much has been done on that subject matter? Lots. But of course, here we're talking about source of creativity. Source of creativity is not mental afflictions. Source of creativity comes from deep within our own mind, which means as long as our mind is disturbed by the mental afflictions, agitated by craving, attachment, jealousy, anger, we're suffocating our creativity, in fact. So if we can reduce and eliminate our mental afflictions, what you will find when the mind becomes more still, you'll become more creative. And also now we often tend to be creative for a little bit selfish motivation. Look at me, how wonderful a musician and wonderful an artist I am. Whereas I think the truly great creative people are the ones who use their creative talents to inspire others for a good purpose. So if we reduce our mental afflictions, not only will we become more creative, we'll become more creative for a more meaningful reason, more beneficial reason. So therefore, the bottom line is, if we reduce and eliminate attachment, we'll enjoy the simple pleasures in life more, our relationships will improve, and we'll become more creative for a more meaningful reason. One last point. We're not going to get rid of attachment by next week. Not going to happen. In fact, in Buddhism, and we'll look at this, see this tomorrow a little bit, this realm that we live in is often called the desire realm. And it's called desire realm, and desire here is another word for attachment, because the main driving force in our life is craving and attachment. And I remember one of the texts I studied from the 4th century, I think Vasubandhu, he said there are two main desires in our life. What do you think they would be? Sex and food. That was the case in the 4th century. I don't think much has changed. Sex and food. So what we need to realize is that craving and attachment is pervasive in our life, but the more we can reduce and eliminate it, the more we will enjoy the simple pleasures in life, the more our relationships will improve, the more creative we'll become. Win-win-win situation. Okay, that's what I wanted to mention on attachment. Any questions? Otherwise we'll take a break.
I'm not really clear on why reducing attachment would help in relationships, assuming we're talking about very close relationships, like the one or few important ones that we have in our lives.
So remember here, attachment is not as it's defined in psychology. Attachment in a relationship is all about me. In fact, attachment sees the other person not as a person, but as a thing, an object, to satisfy me. So we're not even attachment's not looking at the person as a person. From attachment's perspective, that's a thing. to satisfy me. I mean, that's not very nice, is it? You wouldn't like to be looked upon as a thing, would you? No.
But I'm thinking because, I mean, if it's like a real relationship, I don't know, like a mature one, then
Yeah.
then attachment is part of it, like it's not all of it.
Sure. So therefore, what will happen is that, often we talk about love at first sight. Most of the time it's attachment at first sight. And often what happens is after a week or two when the attachment dies down, people go, ooh, what did I see in that person? No? And it's because attachment suddenly diminished and they see that there's no similarity, there's no common ground, there's no basis for a relationship. So therefore, what you will find is that if the relationship is built purely on attachment, it will disintegrate sooner or later, and there'll be a lot of problems. And of course, all relationships have a mixture, And the key point here is to distinguish, because there's always these two dynamics going on, one healthy, one unhealthy. And we need to distinguish these two dynamics and increase the healthy one and decrease the unhealthy one. And you'll find the more you do that, the more the relationship will improve. And of course, if there is only the unhealthy part, the relationship will collapse, and it needs to, because both people are just suffering because of the attachment. It's not healthy for either of the parties.
So the consequences of what you say is that sex is using somebody else's body to enjoy?
If there's attachment, yes. If there's not attachment, no. Depends on the motivation.
Love at first sight. It might be, not only. Not exactly, but it might be.
Yeah.
Maybe food afterwards.
It's clinging.
Whoa.
This attachment is clinging. Is clinging.
Well, there's many words used in this area. There's like craving, attachment, clinging, desire. There's many words used sort of more or less meaning the same thing. Yeah, last question, then we take a break.
You totally convinced me that attachment is there. Now my question is,
How to get rid of it.
yes, is, in more specific words, is the 3 steps you mentioned at the beginning of this day, understanding of the self, the false self, understanding of the impermanent, and understanding the dukkha, the suffering.
Yeah.
Is this,
Yeah.
is practicing this will
Yeah.
eliminate the...
So with not only with attachment, but with all mental afflictions, it's good to have a short-term strategy and a long-term strategy. Of course, the long-term strategy is to get rid of it. And the long-term strategy is that attachment's coming from ignorance, distorted view of reality. So long-term strategy is the wisdom, vipassana practice, realize nature of reality, eliminate. But that could take quite some time. So we want an effective short-term strategy to at least reduce it while we're doing that. And the short-term strategy, and we'll talk more about this tomorrow morning, I'll just briefly mention a couple of points and then we'll take the break. One is mindfulness. This is why, there's the ethics, concentration, wisdom. Concentration is not just the basis of wisdom, but concentration practice has a lot of benefits. Because one is we're developing our mindfulness. So one of the key things to do, if we want any effective short-term strategy, is we need to notice when attachment is arising. If we can see it, we can do something about it before we're out of control. If we're out of control, too late, really. And one thing we can do is simply watch it. If you watch it, it can't take hold of your mind. It'll just go, gone.
What's the movie?
Because the mind is stronger than the heart?
Well, the heart in Buddhism is part of the mind, is the way you use the word heart. So thinking and emotions are all part of the mind. But one other point, and then we'll take a break, is we talked about this impermanence, the fact that everything's changing moment by moment. So you'll often find, what's the antidote to attachment? Impermanence. Because if you, not just intellectually, if you experientially see things as this flow,
You cannot get
You can't grab any. Attachment's got nothing to grab hold of. So you'll find that one measure that your impermanence practice is going well, what you'll notice initially is small things that used to create a little bit of craving or a little bit of irritation won't have that effect anymore. Little things you'll enjoy without the neediness, and little things that used to irritate you go, oh, that doesn't irritate me anymore. And that's because of impermanence. And you won't have to think about it, because experientially you're seeing these things flowing because of your impermanence meditation, and you'll find that you'll be enjoying a lot of little pleasures without this, I gotta have it, I gotta have it. And you go, wow, I really enjoy it. What happened there? Okay, let's take a break and come back at 3:45.